Good afternoon. It's good to see everybody here, and those of you who are joining online, welcome. If this is your first session or your first time joining us online, I'm Rochelle Meineke, and this is our second session of Preserving Your Family Treasures. Before we get started, there was just a couple of housekeeping things I wanted to mention, and I just wanted to remind you to turn off your cell phones or silence them during this time. And also, per latest university guideline, instructors presenting on stage do not need to wear a mask or face covering. If you're wondering why I'm not wearing a mask right now, students and visitors must wear face coverings over their mouths and noses while on all Wichita State University campuses, in all hallways, public spaces, classrooms, and other common areas of the campus building. If you're online and you have a question that you would like to submit, you can do that by emailing the lifelonglearning@wichita.edu. And then they will relay those messages to me, as well as we'll talk about this a little bit later when we have our heirloom show and tell. If you have those and you're online, you can also email those to me at the same place. And I think we will go ahead and get started. Oh, for those of you that are here in person, if you do have a question, or later when we talk a little bit about a reading, if you have a comment, I'm going to ask you to come to the microphone that's over here off to the side. Don't touch the microphone, but I'm asking you to come and speak in that so that it's easier for everyone to hear and so our online students can hear as well. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. So today we're going to talk about photos, documents, books, and newspapers. So anything that has to do with paper, basically. But before we get started, I wanted to talk about preventative conservation. And preventative conservation is about ensuring that collections are displayed, handled, stored, and maintained in sustainable ways that do not lead to damage or deterioration, and that they are preserved as far as possible in an unchanging state. So in the museum, this is what we strive to do, is preventative conservation. When someone donates something to us, our job is to take care of it and keep it from deteriorating. Being stewards of culture and history and art, we want to try to maintain those things for future generations. And so there are things that naturally deteriorate. And the ones that we're going to be talking about today are probably the biggest ones: paper, pretty much, and photos. And so, but there are things that we can do to help slow that deterioration or stop it completely. And so I want to talk about some things that we will also be talking about in every session, the next two sessions as well. And so this will cover everything. So I just wanted to kind of get some vocabulary words out to you and things too, so that you would understand what we're talking about. Humidity and temperature control. This is so important for maintaining your collection, maintaining your items, protecting your items. Humidity and temperature are key agents of deterioration in your heirlooms. Their control is essential to ensure the long-term safe keeping of your collections. So sometimes you will see relative humidity if you're looking at archival things, or and it'll be abbreviated as RH, which is the ratio of water vapor in the air to the amount that it can hold if fully saturated. So low levels of relative humidity imply dry conditions, since the air is then capable of taking up moisture. And the opposite, high values are recorded when the air is humid and unable to take up much more moisture. For example, when the weather's humid or wet. So in the museum, we measure we keep hygrometers in our storage areas, and they're just simple battery operated devices that you can order from Amazon. I don't think you can get them at Walmart. I think you'd have to go to Amazon or something, or one of the archival catalogs, which I'll give you resources for here in a little bit, but they measure temperature and humidity. And that way you kind of know where you are. You know at least if you're in a good range or not. But the different levels of relative humidity really affect the deterioration in objects, especially organic material, such as wood, leather, textiles, ivory, bone, paper, those kinds of things. They're not so sensitive to objects like stone or glass, even, unless you have some painted china. If you know people that did the painted china painting, those sort of thing, those can be susceptible. But glassware, I mean, it is, but it's not as susceptible as organic materials. Metallic objects are susceptible to corrosion and rust. Organic materials can mold and get mildew if it's too humid and too wet. So it's important to maintain that constant temperature and humidity level. Again, talking about humidity. So these are the levels that you should strive for. I know it's not always going to be possible. And even in our building where our museum is, we're on an older building on campus. We have two heating and air units, and it's hard to keep it all the same. So we try to do the best we can, but shouldn't rise above 60% or fall below 40%. And that's just kind of a rule of thumb. And I know it fluctuates. Even in our buildings, it fluctuates. Sometimes it's up to 62, sometimes it's 35. So, sometimes those, and in older homes, it's even more difficult sometimes, but this is kind of a range that you should think about. Now, temperature-wise, the temperatures of your home, you probably are keeping a fairly constant temperature in the main part of your home, and that's fine. But the humidity levels are important. Sometimes I have one storage room that is full of mostly wooden objects. And it's one that's on a different unit. And so sometimes it's difficult to maintain those levels. And so we use humidifiers in there, or dehumidifiers. You can also purchase, if you have a place that's really humid and you're storing things, you can purchase silica packs. So, like if you buy a new purse or wallet and it comes with those little packages inside, those are silica packs that are absorbing the moisture. You can purchase those bigger ones at archival supply places, and you can store those, and it just helps to, soak up that extra moisture. Also, if we have this issue, but we have collections from some of our wooden collections that I mentioned that came to us from a tropical climate, and the wood has split somewhere along the way. Now, there could be a variety of reasons for this, but one of the reasons I think is because it's coming from this tropical humid environment to a drier environment, and it causes that wood to split. So, sometimes if you have damage in objects and you think, there might be some things to that nature as to why that might happen. So too much moisture causes mold. We know that, right? So this is what happens to documents when they get wet and then they're just allowed to stay wet. They have water damage. It's really hard once the mold gets down into those paper fibers to reverse that. And that would take, if it's something really precious that you want to try to save, that would probably take a conservator. I would not try doing anything on your own. And sometimes it may just be irreversible. And sometimes it causes your pages to get really brittle too. Reducing light damage. And we'll talk more about this next week when we talk about textiles, because this is really, natural and artificial light is one of the greatest threats to your heirlooms. So these are some sort of rules that we have in the museum, but these can also be in your home. Reducing the amount of time of which an object is illuminated, varying objects on display. Maybe if you have the things that you want to change out, that would be a great excuse to do that. Reducing illumination to level necessary for comfortable viewing, and eliminating ultraviolet radiation. I'm going to talk more next week about window tinting options for your home. But if you think about what the sun does to your skin, and it does ages our skin, it can discolor our skin, it can cause cancer, all of this, and it's harmful for your organic materials as well. It causes fading, it causes things to get brittle. Again, your inorganic materials like metal and stone, things like that, are not as sensitive to the light. Also, just a note: if has anybody ever been to the Smithsonian? In the American History, I was there a few years ago, but in the American History Museum, I just remember seeing Abraham Lincoln's hat. Do you remember that? And it was so dark in that room, you could barely see it. Well, that's why. This is why, because they're trying to reduce that light. And they probably only have it illuminated for a certain time of the day, probably right when they open and right when they close, it goes off. But I mean, you can barely see it in there. So, National Archives, same kind of thing. So, anyway, that just kind of made me think about that. So, this photo you see, the one on the left is a damaged photo from having some light damage. It's been faded. It was black and white to begin with, and now it's kind of this sepia color. One of the things you can do, which we'll also talk about in a bit, is digitization and scanning those photos. So you think, oh, well, this is ruined. I can't, and you can't do anything to the original photo, really. This is irreversible damage. But with scanners, you can make them look almost even better than they were. So, my mother-in-law used to have a bake shop in Augusta, and this was around Memorial Day, I think. And she put a picture of her father in his military uniform in the window, and it had been colorized a little bit. And so I was working at the museum in Augusta at the time. So I took that picture out of the window. I took it down to the museum and scanned it and copied it on some nice photo paper, put it back in the frame, and took it back down there. And you couldn't even tell the difference. But, the light, even though it wasn't going to be in the window for a long time, it fades it so quickly. And if something happens to your original, that's it. But if something happens to your copy, it doesn't matter. You can make another one. So just, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So just an option for those of you who are wanting to really display your photos. Scanning and making copies is a great alternative. Light and temperature fluctuation can cause dry rot in books. Leather-bound volumes are vulnerable to a chemical degradation process called binding rot or dry rot, and it causes the binding to crumble and decay to a fine powder. The rot is inherent to the tanning process used to produce the leather, but the decay is greatly accelerated when it's been exposed to light. The problem with dry rot also is it can contaminate other books. So if you have a book that has dry rot and you have some other leather books, it can contaminate those books. And if the conditions are damp enough, it can even transfer to fabrics and other materials. And there's really nothing you can do to stop it. I mean, or to reverse that. But if you have a book that has dry rot, you don't necessarily need to throw it out, but you need to make sure that it's wrapped up in some archival plastic or in an archival box, which in this picture you see that it's in a box. It needs to be somehow separated from other volumes if you have something like this. In newspapers, it does not take very long for a newspaper to turn yellow, does it? We have a wood burning stove and we have a basket of newspapers by the stove, kind of under a window. And it doesn't take long at all for some of the yellowing to happen. So that happens very quickly in newspapers. So this is going to be our theme. Acid free is key. Everything that we talk about is going to be acid free. Acid is a substance capable of forming hydrogen ions when dissolved in water. Items that are very acidic are basically self destructive. Acids can weaken cellulose and paper, board, and cloth, making them brittle. And it can migrate. So, acid migration is the transfer of acid from an acidic material to a less acidic or pH neutral material. This occurs when two materials are in contact with each other, such as an acidic mat on acid-free paper. The neutral of lesser acidic paper will absorb some of the acid from the more acidic paper. The neutral paper will become yellow and brittle with age. So, if you are storing something in a cardboard box, which is acidic, and you are storing documents in a cardboard box, which they're acidic, and those two acids will work against each other and they'll start to break down those cellulose fibers, the molecules, and it will just speed up that disintegration. So you want to, if you're storing something in an acid-free container, then it stops that. It stops that chemical reaction. And so it's going to slow that down or stop it completely. So cardboard is bad. That's another. So don't store your heirlooms in cardboard boxes. Not only are they acidic, but if you're storing them in your basement and your basement gets wet, what happens to the things in the cardboard? They're ruined, right? So also that it's best not to store things in basements and attics, especially in older homes, maybe where it's really damp and musty. Newer homes, sometimes basements aren't so bad. And that's where we store things because that's where we have the extra room. That's where our storage rooms are, right? But there are ways you can go about it if that's your only place, is to store your items safely. And cardboard boxes directly on the floor is not a good way to store any items for that matter, but especially your heirlooms, things that you're really trying to protect, things that you really want to save. Attics are mostly not climate controlled. They're hot. And so that's not having those extreme, and then they're cold in the wintertime. So those extreme temperature changes can really affect your objects, especially your organic objects. Or if you have a shed that you store things in that's not climate controlled, same thing. So it's better to store things in the main part of your house where it's relatively the same temperature and humidity all the time. But if you have to store in the basement, you can still use archival materials, or it's even better if you have a choice between cardboard and a plastic tub, go for the plastic tub. So, and you can still wrap things in archival material, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So let's talk about plastics. So a lot of times, if you're looking at archival catalogs or something, they don't always say acid-free for plastics. They'll say inert, which is basically the same thing. It means it's not going to react chemically with the other substances. So the things that you store in those plastics, that's going to stop that chemical reaction, just like the acid-free boxes would stop that chemical reaction. This is the same thing. So polypropylene is a chemically inert material that is also heat resistant and provides a highly protective barrier against moisture and vapor. It is slightly less clear than archival polyester, but is clearer and more rigid than polyethylene, which I know those are all words that maybe you've heard, maybe you haven't. But I just want you to understand what you're looking at. If you look at archival, and if you're looking at a catalog, they will have these definitions as well. But it just means it's archivally safe. It's safe to use. polyethylene, which is very similar to propylene. It's a little bit, it's the plastic is a little clearer and it's a little cheaper. It's not as thick. So it's just a little bit thinner, which I think is probably why it's a little cheaper. Um, but then when you're looking at plastics, everything is measured in this mil. So mil is 1/1000th of an inch and refers to the thickness of plastic. So the higher the mil, the stronger the plastic. So if you're looking for something thick, you want a higher mil than if you're looking for something thinner. And I was going to show this later, but I'll show it now. I don't know if this is propylene or ethylene because I didn't purchase this, and they look very similar. I think it's polypropylene, but this is a sleeve that you can get from an archival supply with the that you can slip your photo inside. So this is what, and when it says it's not completely transparent, you can see it's a little filmy. That's what that means. And I have a table where I brought some archival things with me, so you can look at those later too, because I have some boxes and things of the examples of what I'm talking about. An archival polyester or mylar. It's chemically inert with a high tensile strength and chemical and dimensional stability. It's extremely clear and will never yellow or become cloudy, making it ideal for encapsulation, where a detailed view of the covered item is desired. Inherent static electricity helps to keep items from shifting in enclosures, but also means that archival polyester should not come in contact with charcoal, pastels, or other loose media. So you wouldn't want to store artwork that has loose media. And encapsulation, I'm going to talk about later when we talk about documents and how to keep those safe. And I'm going to tell you what that is, what those are. And I brought some examples to show you what that means. So just just so you know, like if you're storing something in a Ziploc bag, it's not inert. It has the chemicals in it. So those chemicals in a Ziploc bag are going to react with the chemicals in the postcard or whatever you're trying to preserve, and it's going to break that down. It's going to cause it to yellow over time. It's going to cause it to fade. So, it's really important to get those archival plastics, and you can get, a package of like 100 or something. They come in a large amount, so you don't have to buy them individually as well. So this is just some places where you can get, and I think you have copies of the slides, but these are places you can get archival supplies. I use Gaylord Archival a lot. And I will tell you that archival materials are usually not cheap. And so I'm going to give you some alternatives of some things that you can do as well. But those will have all your archival boxes and plastics and silica packs and all of those kinds of things. I know Special Collections at Wichita State, they like to use Hollinger Metal Edge for their storing documents and things. They also, if you have something weird shaped that you can't find a box to fit, they'll make one for you. If you give them the dimensions, they'll make a box, archivally safe box for you. And you can also go to Hobby Lobby and Michael's, the scrapbook section. Most of those items are acid free. So you can use any of those things. As long as it's acid free or inert, you can use those. Matter of fact, the Mylar that we use at the museum, I get at Hobby Lobby, and I brought it today. So, and it's over more in the art section. And we use it. We don't have, at our museum, we don't have a lot of documents, but what we use it for is when we do exhibits. And we always paint our cases before we do an exhibit and let the paint dry and everything. But we don't want to put that object right on the painted surface because of the chemicals in the paint. We don't want those to leach into our objects. So we use the Mylar as a protective barrier against the paint and the object. And it works great because when we, take down the exhibit, we can just remove that easy. Plus it's clear and you can't really see it. So it works great for a lot of different things. Okay, so let's talk about photos and documents. Photos and documents are some of the most common family heirlooms, that they're also some of the most easily damaged. So we're going to take a look at the different types of photographs, kind of the process that those involved, and how to take care of those. If you don't know the date of your photo, if you're not sure, what are some things you can look at in a photo to give you an idea? What are some clues that will help you date a photo? And if you answer me, if you just pull your mask down for a second and shout it out. Yeah. Clothing, the background, okay? The age of the people. Like, okay, so if it's family members and it's, you're looking at a picture of your grandma when she was little or something, okay? What else? Okay, automobiles. And you said scenery, and I was thinking of, landmarks, or like if you're looking at in Augusta, our downtown is bricked. And so it was bricked. They started doing that in the 19 teens. And so I know if I'm looking at a photo where it's just dirt, then I know it's got to be before then. So sometimes landmarks too. Oh yeah, that's a good clue. Say, okay, that tree's way bigger now, so that must have been early on. Okay, so what about this one? What do you think? If you just a guess, what would you say? You say early 1900s or prior? Okay. 1800s? Yeah. I think this one was actually about 1875-ish, something like that. So there's no automobiles, right? So that's a clue. Okay. What about this one? Yeah, everyone's saying 1930s and 40s, and that's absolutely correct. Yeah, because you're looking at what? The automobiles, right? You could still look at the businesses. You could say, oh, that Florsheim, that opened in 1930 or whatever, but you're going to be looking at the cars probably. What about this one? 1950s. Yeah. You're looking at hairstyles, clothing, they're at the soda fountain or a cafe. Yeah, 1950s. So sometimes when we don't know how old a photograph is, if we know what type of photo we have, that can also give us a clue to how old it is. So these are the 6 types we're going to talk about today, and we're going to talk about how to take care of each one of these. You will see there's a theme in taking care of them, but um, some of them have some unique situations with them, with the way they were processed. So daguerreotypes were produced in the 1840s to 1860s. They're typically small, about 2 3/4 by 3.5. They were housed in some kind of case, um, constructed of wood with metal hinges, also considering all of these materials, cloth, some kind of, it wasn't velvet, but some kind of cloth, sort of a fancy, a lot of times they were red or orange, or and some cording to make them look really fancy. They were developed by Louis Jacques Monde Daguerre, and he discovered how to fix images produced by cameras obscura. And cameras obscura was the darkened box where you put the maybe the drape over the box, with a convex lens or aperture for projecting the image of external object onto a screen inside. And daguerreotype is a direct positive process with a silver coated copper plate support and a silver mercury amalgam image. Image highlight areas are composed of silver mercury, while dark areas remain silver metal. Daguerreotypes are easily identified by a mirror-like, highly polished silver surface and its duly negative positive appearances when viewing from different angles or in raking light, which is kind of that sideways light. The image may sometimes exhibit subtle dry pigment hand coloring. The process involved exposing a silver-plated sheet of copper to chemical fumes. The polished silver makes it reflective like a mirror, and it seems to almost kind of float on the surface. So because of that process and the chemically produced process, and the image is right there on the surface, it makes it highly susceptible to abrasion. It scratches very easily and tarnishes very easily. So how should you take care of that? First of all, you shouldn't ever try to remove it from its case. Just leave it in the case because it's going to be really easy to scratch it and damage it and tarnish it. And it's been in that case for a long time and it's just going to do more harm than good. So leave it in the case. And storing it, keeping it away from direct light. The light will cause it to fade drastically if you keep it out, sitting out. So if you keep it closed, I would even put like maybe a piece of acid-free paper or tissue or something in between those two, like this one, maybe in between just to protect it even more, and wrap it up in some either some archival plastic or put it in an archival box. And these are small, so you can store them in a drawer. That's okay. But they need to be wrapped in something, not just stuck in the drawer. So it would be better to keep. And then that way you're going to protect that the covering, which is usually some sort of fabric covering on it. So it's going to protect that if you kind of keep that protected. And all of the, yes. The cover. Okay. So if the cover, if it's starting to fall apart, was her question. So yeah, I mean, if it's falling apart and it's coming out and it can come out easily, I think that's okay. I mean, if it's just falling out of it, it would be better to take that and put it in some sort of archival sleeve to protect it if it's just really crumbling apart. Otherwise, if it's still sort of intact, but it's not in great shape, I would still put it in some archive, keep it whole if you can, and put it in some plastic. Yeah. I wouldn't glue it back in. Yeah, I would probably just try to keep it, because the glue can also react with that metal and the chemicals that were used, and I think it would cause damage over time. So I would still just, if it's still fragile and falling apart, if you put it in some plastic, at least it's going to keep everything together. Yeah. This is what it looks like. Those that are tarnished and scratched, exposed to light. You can see how that's kind of that halo around the people too. Okay, ambrotypes. Ambrotypes are very similar to daguerreotypes. They were produced from 1854 to 1880s. And they were less expensive to produce. And the process involves applying an opaque dark backing to a glass plate negative so the image appears positive. They don't have the same surface, whereas daguerreotypes, it was like it was floating on the surface. The ambrotypes, not so much. So they're not quite as susceptible to tarnishing, or I'm sorry, to abrasion as the daguerreotypes, but they still are. I mean, they still could scratch very easily. They still come in the same type of casing with the wood and those images as well. And the let me get down to talking about that collodion. There was this, they still have this covering on it, and it was a syrupy solution of nitrocellulose and a mixture of alcohol and ether. And they use this in old photography. They don't use this anymore, but they use this in photography. And so that chemical substance too, I'm not sure what would happen with, she's talking about gluing that, and that's on the back, which may be okay, but I still wouldn't, it may have some strange reaction to that. So I would stay away from that adhesive. But also because of that, it makes it very susceptible to light damage. So keeping that out of the light, it's just going to fade it into nothing. I don't know if you've seen daguerreotypes where you can barely see the image. Those are things that have been exposed to light and probably high humidity as well. Okay, tintypes. 1856 to 1890. So they were used for quite a while. They were made using an iron plate. A tintype is a direct positive with a lacquered iron support, collodion binder layer, and silver image layer. Most tintypes can be thought of as underexposed image, having low contrast and limited tonal range. The varnished, usually with black, brown paint, lacquer, or enamel, iron support shows through in dark areas. Where silver image particles are few, the image is basically a silver negative set against this background, bringing out highlights composed of silver particle concentrations that appear milky white. So sometimes those were also placed in the hinged cases, but typically they were housed in paper sleeves, which I don't think I've ever seen an original tintype with the original sleeve. I think those got thrown away or torn or something. I think people didn't keep them. But that is going to be the best way to protect your items, is buying those archival sleeves, the polypropylene, polyethylene sleeves to put those tintypes in. These are also they can scratch as well, but they're also, because they're metal, they're very susceptible to corrosion and rust. So if they start rusting, then it also affects that emulsion layer, and it can flake, and that emulsion layer that's on the top can just come off. And so that's going to affect, obviously, the image. It's going to be really faded. So putting it in a sleeve, storing it in a box. I brought an archival box that for photos. Those are great. Those would be great for tintypes because the edges on a tintype are kind of sharp too. So you want to be careful about how you store them or what you store them with. So if you just have one tintype, you just want to make sure it's not going to snag or scratch something else. So having that in a sleeve and then having it in a box is going to protect it. Carte de visite, or CDVs, as you'll see them sometimes abbreviated, from 1860s to 1870s. And these were produced in 1854 by a Paris photographer named André Adolphe de Zeri. He patented the 2.5 by 4-inch carte de visite format. And they were created by using a sliding plate holder and a camera with 4 lenses. This was much cheaper and easier to do than the daguerreotypes and the ambrotypes. Those were a lot more expensive. The process was a lot more involved. This was a lot easier. And so this format really took off all over the world. And it was inspired by calling cards. They're about the same size as the calling cards that people would take with them on social visits, and they would leave them in the home. There was a dish or something where you could leave your calling card with your name on it and maybe a little emblem of some kind. That's what these were inspired by. So it was about that same size and made out of very similar paper. It was kind of this thin cardboard paper. And the Civil War saw a rise in popularity of these carte de visites because they were small enough that they could exchange. The soldiers would go, and this was a lot of time the first time people have had formal pictures taken. And so they would go to the studio in their uniform. Photographers also started taking photos outside, which was kind of a new thing. And so they would take photos in their uniform, and then they could leave those with their family members or their loved ones, maybe their wife or fiance or girlfriend, and they could exchange these photos. And then they could exchange photos with them as well. As time went on, the paper got thicker. So if you have a carte de visite that is really thin, then it's probably going to be closer to that 1860s range. And as time went on, the paper got thicker. So that's kind of a way you can tell too on maybe, what time range yours fits in. Early photos had square corners, later ones had rounded corners. And these are very common in photo albums. If you have some old photo albums, these type of pictures were really common for photo albums as well. And I'm moving on to cabinet cards because these are very similar to the carte de visite. They were basically produced the same way, they're just bigger. So they're still, the photo is mounted on thin paper and then mounted on thicker paper. And the difference is that they're bigger, but also the photographer would have their logo on the side. So you will see the photography studio or just the name of the photographer and the town, which is kind of nice because then you know where it's from. You know where the photo's from at least. And sometimes it'll be on the back. They won't have them on the side, they'll have them on the back. So because these were produced in such a large time frame, to know maybe where yours fits in this range, you can look at the color of the mount. The darker colors, such as brown, burgundy, green, or black, were later than 1880s, 1890s. Early ones didn't have borders at all. And then a single line border appeared in 1885 to 1900. And embossed patterns a little bit later. So if it's thicker and it's really fancy, it's probably later. If it's pretty simple, then it's probably one of the earlier ones. So these are a little bit different than the other two photograph styles. So we've got this kind of cardboard type backing. So these are going to be very susceptible to humidity and temperature changes. And light, of course. Light is going to fade out any photo you have. Doesn't matter what it is. Light is going to fade it out. So having these envelopes, and that's what we have here. Well, they're sort of like cabinet cards. They're not cabinet cards, but they're printed on a backing that is similar. So you can look at those at break if you want to. I'll set some out so you can see them so we're not all touching them and handling them just to be safe. But putting those in the sleeves and storing those in an archival box vertically like this is great if you can do that. You can also make your own envelopes. You can use most computer paper that you get just anywhere, Walmart, Home Depot, wherever, is acid free. So knowing that can help you with some inexpensive storage. So if you had a piece of paper and you folded it in half maybe, and you could stick your photo in there, you could even write on it what it is, and then put it in acid-free folders. And that's a really inexpensive way to protect your photos. And you could store those in a filing cabinet, a metal filing cabinet somewhere in your home where it's going to be your temperature and humidity is going to be level. Brownie Camera. So these were produced for quite a long time. The Brownie was a long-running popular series of simple and inexpensive cameras made by Eastman Kodak, introduced in 1900. It introduced the snapshot to the masses. It was basic cardboard box camera with a simple meniscus lens that took 2¼ inch square pictures on 117 roll film. It was invented by Frank A. Brownwell. The name comes from the mythological spirits and folklore, the brownies, that were popular in the Palmer Cox cartoons. Over 150 Brownie cameras were shipped in the first year of production, and then an improved model came out the next year. So this was marketed for just everyday people because people were starting to take snapshots more. So photography was getting a lot easier, and this was just, you didn't have to go to a photography studio. You could just take photos at home. You could take snapshots at home. And then with our advent of the automobile and more people driving and traveling, then people were taking pictures on vacations and as they went along. So these became really popular. So you probably have a lot of your family photos were made up from these Brownie cameras, which they're a lot thinner than the other photos that we've been looking at. So in order to, those take a little bit more care. But still, the archival plastic, archival photo albums are great for these. And you can also get, if you have an acid-free photo album, not your photo album from 1985. Everybody know what I'm talking about? The kind that peels off the, yeah, no, not that kind. A new acid-free photo album. And you can purchase these, and I use these for my daughter graduated high school this year, and we had a graduation party, and I printed off a bunch of pictures and I made this display, but I didn't want to stick the pictures on the poster board because I mean, even though those were digital and I can print them off again, but I didn't want to ruin them. So I went and bought the photo corners. And so you can get a bag, and there's a ton of them in there. And you get a bag of these photo corners, and they have adhesive on one side, and then they're open on the other. So you can just put them where you want them on your album. You can just slide your photograph in there. And so no adhesive has to touch your photo at all. And they have these at Walmart, and it's still in the scrapbook section. You can get those. So that's a great alternative for trying to figure out how to take care of those pictures. And you can write underneath the picture or something. And they also have, there's photo albums where they have slots where you can put those in. You just want to be careful with these because they are really thin. And you just want to be careful they don't tear, but still keeping them away from light and keeping them protected. Here are just some things I was talking about so you can kind of get a look at what they look like. Those sleeves at the top are great. And then the photo album. This photo storage kit from Gaylord Archival is $50. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's the box that you see. And it comes with 100 polypropylene sleeves and envelopes. So just to give you an idea. And you'll also see things that say lignin free, and that's a good thing. Lignin is an organic substance found in wood pulp, and it works to break down that paper. It also works with the acid. So if you see something that says lignin free, that's good. You want something that says lignin free if you can find that storage. And then also just another option, they have these sleeves that you can, these are nice because you can put them in a binder, that you could just purchase a binder and then buy these archival plastic sleeves, and you can just slide your photos into those. And those are great for those Brownie photos too. But this one is mounted on some acid-free cardstock, which I think most cardstock produced nowadays is acid-free. So, and then you can just write on that what it is, just write on the cardstock. And then you can buy some archival pencils and markers too if you want to write on your photos. So what should you avoid? So these are just some kind of rules of thumbs about to avoid when dealing with photographs. When you're handling them, wash your hands. We use gloves, although it's really hard to handle photographs with gloves, unless they're the cabinet cards or something. But if you can order those from the archival supply too, but those white cotton gloves that we use those all the time in the museum. Don't write on the back of the photo with the ballpoint or felt tip pen. Unless it's specifically marked for photos, most ink contains acids, which just is going to eat through that eventually. Or sometimes if you've seen where you write on it and then it shows on the other side, and I know probably most of your photos may have it written on already. It's done. It's okay. It's all right. But from now on, if you think about maybe trying to use archival or pencil. Pencil's great. Pencil works great on cabinet cards too. Those are great. Don't use rubber bands or paper clips to hold photos together. Those rust and damage photos over time. When it say don't display important photos, just as an alternative, think about scanning your photo, getting a nice quality scan on photo paper. You could do it yourself. If it's larger, you can take it to Office Depot, or we use City Blueprint downtown a lot. They do a great job and they're very reasonable. And you can get it reproduced, and then you can hang that anywhere you want. It doesn't matter. And then you can store your original, and then you have that forever. So that's what I mean about not displaying important photos. Avoid exposing photographic materials to anything containing sulfur dioxide, fresh paint fumes, plywood, cardboard, and fumes from cleaning supplies. So that's just, if you're going to paint your room, you're going to take your pictures down anyway, probably, or move them until those paint fumes have subsided a little bit. Okay, before we go to break, City Blueprint. City Blueprint, and it's on Waterman. It's great. Or if you want a photo blown up and maybe mounted on some gator board, which is like a hard backing or whatever, they do all kinds of things, and they're very reasonable. Oh yeah, the photography. Yeah, I can't think of what it's called. Yeah. Yes, there are places in Wichita where you can get things reproduced if you want to. That's just where we go. That's what we use. City Blueprint does not do photo restoration. Now, they might be able to, if you gave them a scan, like you sent them a picture, they might be able to tweak it for you a little bit, just do some editing. But as to that, but as far as the restoration, I don't believe they do that. So somebody asked me this last week. Are you here today? They were asking me about the photo album and how to remove the photos. I don't know if he's here. Yeah, okay. So how many of you have these photo albums with the plastic cover and the sticky? Yeah. Yeah. Those were so popular, right? 60s, 70s, 80s. Yeah. I don't know if they still make them. They probably do. But everybody probably has some of these photos. And that mylar plastic that's covering them is very acidic. And the adhesive, it gets gummy and yellow over time. And you can probably see that your photos are already faded, right? And some of those, like the Polaroids that were popular, I think those came out of the camera faded. I mean, those fade so easy. But so how do you get those out if you want to get them out? What do you do? One of the things you can do is take some dental floss and carefully go on the edges underneath your photo, between the photo and the adhesive there, and gently, very, very gently, try to remove the photo that way. You can also take a little micro spatula, and those are, I don't know if they have those in the hardware section, but they have them in art supply, I know. Or you could do something really thin. I wouldn't do a knife just because, well, it needs to be probably thinner than a butter knife even. And I wouldn't do anything with a sharp edge. So be careful with that. So if that doesn't work, what do you do? Well, you can heat those items. You can heat your dental floss with take your blow dryer and heat that dental floss and then try it. Or heat your spatula and then try. Don't take the blow dryer though and blow it right on the photo. You can maybe, depending on where it is in the photo album, maybe go to the side a little bit just to help loosen up that adhesive, but don't blow it directly on your item. And then if that doesn't help, what do? You can't get it off. Put it in the freezer. Put it in the freezer. I would try it in short increments, like 5 minutes. Just try it for 5 minutes and see if that helps. If not, maybe a little bit longer, but you don't want to put it in too long. You don't want to put it in and forget about it, because then when you take it off, take it out, there'll be all that condensation that's going to be on your photos, and you don't want that. So just put it in for a short amount of time and see if that doesn't just dry out that adhesive, where it may just, those pictures may just pop off. Or try the same technique again with the dental floss and the spatula if you just get it cold. Now, the gentleman that had the photo album last week had a document that was stuck too. That's trickier. And I've tried to remove documents from adhesive before, and sometimes you just can't. You just have to leave it, because you're going to do more damage and tear it. But the freezing might help. You might try the freezing, because that might be a good, safe way to do that. And if they don't come out, it's just not working, what I would do is take that Mylar out of there, just take that plastic off, maybe put something over it that's an archival plastic, but you can also scan those things. You could scan the document and have that, if you can't remove it. But if it's just gonna do more damage, I mean, the idea is to preserve your photos and documents. So if you're gonna tear them or damage them, just leave them be and just try to scan them. Okay, we are going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Okay. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started for our second half. I do have a question from an online student about something a little different, but what is the best way to store, preserve phonographic records, and what about compact discs? You will be surprised what you find in those archival catalogs. So they have the archival plastic sleeves for just about everything. So they have those sleeves and archival boxes that you for albums, photograph albums, and compact discs. So that's what I would suggest, putting them in the archival plastic sleeves in those boxes. And they have boxes specifically designed for that. So that's what I would do to store those, as those are also very susceptible to abrasion. And the chemical on the phonograph, to light and all of those things are still going to affect it. I would not store them in your basement or your attic. I would store them again in the main part of your house where they're not going to experience those temperature fluctuations. And then you should be good for those. Okay, let's move on to documents. So understanding our paper a little bit makes a difference on understanding how to preserve those. So it seems sometimes like paper that was made a long time ago, some of our old paper is better than some of our newer paper. And it was because of the way that it was made. So before 19th century, Western paper was made from cotton and linen clothing rags. So paper is made of cellulose, a repeating chain of glucose molecules derived from plant cell walls. So one measure of paper quality is how long those cellulose chains are, and subsequently the paper fibers. So long fibered paper is stronger and more flexible and durable than short fibered paper. So in the presence of moisture, acids from the environment like pollution, poor quality enclosures, anything acidic is going to be breaking down those glucose chains. So before the 19th century, this process largely involved the long fibers of the raw material. While fibers may shorten with age, rag fibers tend to remain strong and durable, especially if they have not been stored properly and in conditions not overly warm and humid. In the mid-19th century, wood replaced rags as the raw material for paper manufacture. Wood is processed into paper by mechanical or chemical pulping, which produces shorter fibers. So the fibers are shorter in more recent or newer formed paper and longer fibers in the older papers. That's why the older paper seems more durable than sometimes newer paper. Newspapers are printed on mechanically pulped paper. Chemical pulping removes lignin and does not cut up the cellulose chains as thoroughly as mechanical pulping, making it a stronger paper. Acid form in paper due to absorption of the pollutants in the air, and paper is very susceptible to damage by light and moisture and all those things we just talked about. So it's they're still going to affect just like the photographs, but then we've got the moisture is so bad for paper, and causes mold and mildew and those sorts of things. So let's talk about what we should not do. Don't use paper clips on your historic documents. Don't use staples or rubber bands or tape or glue. Just stay away from those things. So even, stay away from the Scotch tape. If you have a tear in your document, I know it's so tempting to want to tape it, but don't, because that tape is acidic and it turns yellow and brittle and causes all kinds of problems. Even archival tape. So be really careful with that. Don't laminate things. Laminating is permanent, and it can really decrease the value of your object. And then, of course, monitor your light and temperature. So this is an example of a document that had paper clips on it. So you have the paper clips, and then it gets, if you look at the body itself, I mean, from what you can tell from this photo, the paper itself doesn't look too bad, but it's the way it was handled. Here's tape damage. And it's really hard, if not impossible, to remove that old tape because it's going to leave it's going to leave that residue on there anyway. So if you have a document that has somebody's taped it and it has that, you're probably better to just leave it because it's going to cause more damage trying to remove the tape. It's going to tear the object. So how should you store documents? You want to store them flat in a dry, cool, dark area. Papers should always be stored in acid-free, alkaline materials like boxes, folders, or polyester film folders, which is like that, similar to the polypropylene, the clear plastic. And choose a location that's free from light, dust, pest. Yes, you have a question? I'll tell you in just a minute. We'll get to that in just a minute. So if you can choose a place in your house that is like an interior closet, shelf, up off the floor. Don't store things on the floor. If you'll notice, when you look at archival boxes, even these boxes here, they're acid-free archival boxes, but they're still kind of a cardboard type material. They're not cardboard. Cardboard's bad. They're not cardboard, but it still is going to absorb moisture. So if you have those archival boxes and they're laying on your floor and they're going to get wet, or pests are going to get into them, or your pets or whatever. So it's better if you could store them up on a shelf, documents. You can also put your documents in your acid-free folders in a filing cabinet, and you can even put dividers of that, your acid-free paper in between to protect them if you want to do it that way. Don't store them in the attic. Don't store them in the basement. Don't store them out in your shed. Make sure there's some place where they're going to be protected. Yeah. He's asking if you have a stack of documents, should you put paper between them? I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea to separate those, and you can just put your computer paper in between them. Yeah, if you have several together, I think that's a good idea. I think that's a good way to do it. You don't have to have plastic for every single one. It'd be great if you did, but if you store them all in an acid-free box, you're fine. Yeah. And here's what I'm talking about when I say, and I'm talking acid-free folders, they're just look like folders. You can also get envelopes. They're acid-free. And those boxes. There are some things at Hobby Lobby and Michael's that you can use, but some of those things you're going to have to order from an archival supply. Okay, so encapsulation. Encapsulation is sandwiching a document between two pieces of that clear archival polyester or mylar. And two or more edges of the polyester are then sealed together, often using double-sided tape, acid-free tape, which I brought today you can look at. Encapsulation protects documents from risks of handling and holds fragile items together. So if you have a document that's in pieces, this is a way that you're not using any adhesive to put it together, but this is a great way to hold those documents together that are falling apart. Someone brought a document last week and showed me, I think it was I don't know if it was a land deed or an abstract or something. And when she opened it up, it was torn on the where it's been folded because it just has weakened over time, as documents do. And so that would be a great way to encapsulate and keep that protected. So you're not actually putting it together, but it's going to stay together, if that makes sense. And there's a little static electricity in there too that kind of tends to hold it. Special collections at Obla Library, they do a lot of encapsulating. And so I asked them if I could borrow something just to show you today. So they let me borrow a few things. These are all replica things and things they use for education. So they're not like actual things that they didn't let me take, historical documents or whatever. But I have them on the table. But this is a postcard. This one is the archival polyester. It's just not taped on the sides. But you can make your own covering, and you can get that that archival polyester. It's called Mylar. You'll see it in Mylar. There's a roll of it over here that we haven't even opened. It's from Hobby Lobby. And you can take that, and what you do is you measure your document, and then you cut your Mylar to about an inch or two bigger than your document. And then you take your acid-free double stick tape, and you just tape each side, and then leave a side where you can slide your document in, or if it's in pieces, you're going to have to just be a little careful. And then just put your document in there and then seal it up. And that way you can handle it, and it's going to be safe forever. You still need to keep it away from direct light. If you have maps, this is a great way you can encapsulate maps. This is great for protecting those. And I have one over here. You can look at it and see. And books and newspapers. Handling books, again, just, whenever you handle your family heirlooms, you would just make sure that your hands are really clean. If you're not wearing gloves, just make sure that, and it is hard to handle documents and photos and those things with gloves. Sometimes we use nitrile gloves, which are latex-free gloves. We use those. I use those sometimes too when I'm handling slick pottery and things. And so, keeping your area clean where you're handling those. Don't just grab your old book, by the spine and pull it off the shelf. You want to grab it by the sides and pull it, because those bindings, the spine, get really fragile. And so we want to lessen the way we handle those. We want to lessen handling of the spine at all if we can. So you want to handle it on the sides and pull it out. And don't force the book open. Most of the time, those old books, the spine has, the glue has lessened, and it's kind of come loose a little bit. So sometimes they do just fall open, but sometimes they don't. So you don't want to force it open. And in the museum, we use this for pottery, but it would be suitable for books as well. It's just kind of like a bean bag, if you want to put your book on that, just to protect that spine. Don't use paper clips in your books. Don't dog ear, and don't put your bookmarks in your old books because they're acidic. And that acid is just going to react with the acid in the pages. So don't do that. Don't use tape to repair, rubber bands, glue. Don't use any of that on your books. Now, if you have a book that really is special to you and it's just falling apart, it might be worth seeing a conservator that specializes in book binding to do that. But I wouldn't try to do it yourself. Storing books, keeping away an even temperature and humidity, same rule for documents and photos. No direct sunlight. Keep away from radiators and vents. So the heat from your heater or your radiator or heat can crack the leather spines, and it can make that glue brittle. So you want to keep them away from those heating areas. Keep them dusted. Dust can actually lead to mold and mildew, and encourages insects to come. So you want to keep those. The best way to store, if you want to enjoy your antique books, which you should, but the best way is a glass front cabinet. So if you can, and that way it protects them away from direct sunlight. It's going to protect those books. If you have a book that's particularly old or particularly fragile, I would definitely wrap that one and put it in some archival plastic, because especially if you have a book that has dry rot, I would not put it with the other books. I would store it separately away from the other books so it doesn't contaminate them. But you don't necessarily need to store them in archival, every single one of them. If you have a collection of them, if you just have a few books, then it's not a bad idea to store them in those archival boxes. That's always an option for storage, always, for anything. But I know you like to look at your books and enjoy them probably, so that's just fine. Just make sure that they're in a place that they're going to be safe. They're not going to get wet. They're not going to have heat blown on them. They're not going to have sunlight on them. And just limit handling. That's the thing, especially with books, because the more you handle the pages, the more you handle those bindings, it loosens the glue, and it just breaks down those cellulose fibers. Also, don't pack them too tightly on the shelf. You want them to be able to breathe a little bit and stack like size books together. It just helps lessen the strain on the books. So what if your book gets wet and it gets mold? Maybe you had it in your basement, it got wet. There are some things you can do to help remove that, as long as it hasn't gotten too far into your book. But if it's relatively dry, if you take a piece of wax paper and put it in between those pages where it seems like the mold is, just to help eliminate the spread of that mold, take a soft brush and you can just brush that off, get as much off as you can. And then if you take just very, very lightly, you can take a cotton ball maybe with just really damp hydrogen peroxide or diluted alcohol, and then kind of rub it on that area just to keep it from that mold from spreading. And then wrap it in a towel, put some paper towel. You can also use paper towel instead of wax paper, but the wax paper does really well. Wrap it in a towel, put something hard on it, and just kind of let it sit there for a little bit. If it's a little damp. If it's dry, you don't need to do that. But if it's a little damp, you want to kind of help dry those out. But if it's dry, you don't need to do that. Just take your alcohol or your hydrogen peroxide and put it on those pages. Wait till that's dry, and then you can remove your wax paper, and that should keep it from spreading. Now, if it's wet, you need to act quickly. If your book gets wet, if you have, some water in your basement or something and your book gets wet, you can take that. Don't try to brush them or wipe them or dry them off. You can dry off the cover, but don't try to do anything to the pages because they're going to tear. You can put them in a plastic bag, preferably archival, but if you don't have one, that's okay. This is triage. We're trying to do the best we can. Put it in the freezer for a while, maybe an hour or so. And then take it out, and you're going to put paper towel in between those pages. Then this time, since it's wet, you're going to wrap it in a towel and put something heavy on top of it and just let it set for a while and let that the paper towels absorb that moisture. And that should do it. If it seems like, just let it dry for a while. You could put it in front of a fan for a little bit just to help dry it out. If you feel like you need to retreat it, go ahead and retreat it, put it in the freezer again, and wrap it in plastic first. Don't just put it in there by itself. Wrap it in plastic, put it in the freezer, and then you can repeat that process. Newspapers, it's going to be very similar in how you handle those and how we store them. Most newspapers are folded, right? So really just keep them folded. They're easier to store that way if they're usually folded in half. If you don't want to fold them in half and you want them open, it takes up a lot of room to store them. Just know that. But don't try to fold it back on itself or try to force it to fold a certain way. Just let it fold in the natural way it wants to, but don't use same with documents. It's really the same rule because it is a document pretty much. Don't use paper clips. Don't use rubber bands. If you have newspaper clippings, Don't clip those together. You can put those in an archival acid-free envelope or something if you want to store them in that way. You could even encapsulate them if it's something really important, or put them in plastic sleeves. Storing them, it's really the same rules apply. Flat storage is recommended for newspapers. Most museums don't really take newspaper donations anymore. One thing, they take up a lot of space to store properly. Another thing, most newspapers are digitized now. So if you're looking up obituaries, that kind of thing, most things are digitized. So most museums aren't even accepting newspapers anymore just for that reason. Here's, like I said, there's a box for everything just about, and you can find boxes for albums, you can find boxes for newspapers. And notice there's a Life magazine. So this size of box is great for newspapers, magazines, sheet music. It's all kind of about that same size. That would all work for these type of boxes. And they're easy to get in and out of. You can see that kind of opens down on one side. There's a flap. And then, of course, our plastic. So I want to talk about digitization just a minute. This is a fire that happened in 2018, September 2nd, 2018. Fires tore through the National Museum of Brazil, destroying thousands of irreplaceable artifacts. The museum held Latin America's largest collection of historical artifacts. So this building was owned by the government, and it was just falling apart, and they didn't take the time and money to fix it up. And it was found that later that it was a faulty air conditioning system, heating and air unit, and that they did not replace the sprinklers in the ceilings. So none of the sprinklers worked. So they had just started a digitization project in their museum, but they hadn't gotten very far. So and some of the objects were salvageable, but a lot of them were just destroyed completely. And this was November of 2019, so almost a year ago, when there was flooding in Venice, as there is flooding in Venice frequently, but this was a really bad flooding. And it was threatening to damage historic buildings and museums, as well as homes and businesses. And so a group of art experts were called in to handle art objects that had been damaged or to save them from damage. Even university students were going into libraries and grabbing books and archives and taking them to safe places. And then this was January of this year. In New York City, the Museum of Chinese in America was engulfed in flames, and the fire destroyed up to 85,000 artifacts, which held significant cultural materials documenting Chinese life in America. About 35,000 items were digitized and safely stored on a backup server. So even though the originals are gone and damaged, they had the copies. And that's what I want to encourage you to do with your documents and your photos, is to digitize those. The notebook that I brought last week that had my grandmother's poetry, that binder, we have probably this is my mother here, she's in the front, she has some. So we're going to do this project, but we have probably 10 of those binders, maybe, of her poetry. And what happens if most of them are at my house? So my house catches on fire or something, they're gone. But if we scan them all, and then we have them. So by scanning, there's a couple different scanners. One you may have already at your house, because if you have a printer, you most likely have a flatbed scanner. Those are great for photos. These are great for really fragile documents to scan. If you would rather not do that, you can also take these to Office Depot or places like that, and they'll help you with that. But scan those things, scan your photos, scan your documents, and that way you have them. Keep them. You can scan them to your computer. You can scan them put them on a flash drive. It's the little thumb drive. You can save things on the cloud. I would do it in multiple ways. I wouldn't just save it on your computer because computers crash. Things happen, right? So I would save it to maybe multiple flash drives. And maybe you want to put one in someone else's house. Maybe you want to put it in your safety deposit box at the bank. Any way you can think of to keep it safe, because those things, then if something happens to those photos and those documents, you have copies of them, which is so important. So museums all over the world are really getting on board with digitization and trying to digitize all their collections. And it's not just scanning, taking photographs too, because we can still lose our items, but we can have those photographs. It's not the same, but at least you have memory of that. So the flatbed scanners are great. Those feeder scanners, if you have documents, not super fragile ones, but if you have documents, you can feed several of those in at once. So those are great. Um, if you have something that's big and you want to digitize it, you're going to have to take it somewhere else to do that, because there's just not. We have, and I don't know if they let people use this normally, but I know at Wichita State, the library, they have a really big scanner, and I've used that too. So, and maybe if you ask nicely, I don't know if they let people use that or not, but that's a possibility. And also, you can get an app on your phone. I have one on my phone and I've used it to scan, and it'll scan to your email, and then you can still put it on your computer. They're not as good as the other scanners, but it works. And I've used this too. You can scan your fragile documents this way with your phone, and it works. So these are just some scanners or some apps that you can go to if you have a smartphone. All right. Well, we're going to move on to our talk about our reading briefly, but I want to have time also for our show and tell. There was a question last week about cleaning. Just a second, I'll get to some questions. I'm sorry. Um, Questions for cleaning bronze. And I wanted to wait until this week because even though we didn't talk about that, but I just wanted to make sure I got my measurements right. There's all kinds of metal cleaners out there, but this is a good non-chemical, easy one that you can just make at home. And so you just mix this up, let it set for a while, and you can rinse it off. And it works really well with brass and copper too, just so you know. You can also make a paste with lemon juice and baking soda. I have not tried this. I don't know if it works. I just read that it does. I've heard that it works quickly on bronze. So lemon juice and baking soda. I don't know. You can try that one. But this one does work. The flour, the salt, and the vinegar, you can try that on your objects. So your article for today that you were reading about what to do. What do you think? Does anybody have any comments? And if you do, I know it's not the most convenient, but if you could come up here to the microphone and share that with us. What did you think about this article? Anybody? Who has decided? Does anybody have a way that they've decided already who they're going to give things to? Do you know who you're going to give things to? Yeah? She has one granddaughter and she's taking it whether she wants it or not. Okay. Anybody else forcing heirlooms on their family? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. One son carrying on the family name, so he's getting the genealogy collection. I can identify with that a little bit because I'm an only child. So, yes. Okay. Okay. the things that you've inherited. Yeah. Okay. Um, yes. Yeah. Right. So yeah, so her family wants her to, she asked, "Well, what do you want?" And they said, "We want you to have a sale." So yeah, I think this happens. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so not only am I an only child, but my mother's an antique dealer. So what do you, yeah, there you go. I'm in trouble. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So she has some silver dollars that she's had for a long time and doesn't wants someone to have them. And I think that's the consensus for most people is you want someone to care about those things that are important to you and about your family. This is an article that I ran across, and also an online student had a comment about, they brought up dementia and how, it's important to decide some of these things now. We think we have time and we don't want to talk about it now. We don't want to think about it now, but now's the time when people are healthy and well and can think clearly, and that can cause an issue later on. But this was just an article that I found, and some of it was I think was good. Some of her things, some of them I'm not so sure. But she was talking about, appointing a trustee, and so sometimes if there's a big family, or maybe there's things of value and people can't agree, and there's going to be fighting or whatever, so sometimes it's good to kind of hire somebody to help split those things up. um, Take care of business in the living years, and this goes along with the comment about dementia and how, take care of these things now, and if there's something that a particular person wants, then kind of earmark that for them or whatever. Um, First generation first. So this is kind of the idea that it goes on to, like, you were saying, this goes on, the genealogy information was going on to your son, or so it's kind of passing that on, maybe from parents to children instead of skipping a generation to go to grandchildren. But it doesn't matter, it's really your preference on what you want to do. um, And especially if there's somebody that wants, I know that my aunt has my grandmother's recipes. I would love to have those recipes, and I've told her, hey, just, keep me in mind. I'd like to have the recipes. So, I mean, I think it's good to go ahead and talk about those things, talk about those things now. And I've heard of people even at family gatherings kind of talking about those things and kind of what people might want, and then writing those things down and those people's names and what they might want to have, and talking about those things when you can. Sometimes when someone passes away, objects get distributed before anybody even has a say, because later on somebody will go, whatever happened to that bowl that grandma had? Oh, well, so and so got it, you know and so, if there's something that somebody wants, they should be able to talk about that, and kind of be able to speak up and let their desires be known. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great idea for downsizing. Take it now. Yeah, that's a great idea. Oh, well, was saying that, talking about when you're downsizing, or maybe you're going to move, maybe you're going to move to a smaller place. You don't need all the stuff anymore. And so go ahead and give it away now. Go ahead and give those things now instead of waiting. That's a good idea. Yeah. And then she kind of had, I thought this was sort of silly, but choosing from a hat, like if people don't know, or um, they even talked about sort of, uh, I don't know how this would work, but sort of a white elephant type thing where you draw a number or something, you get to pick items that you want, or you can trade them with somebody else. It might be fun. Who knows? It could cause problems too. And then drawing straws, the same type of thing. Does somebody have a question? Okay. So kind of that idea. Yeah. So taking one thing at a time. Yeah. Oh, okay. So giving those things for Christmas. Those are all really good ideas. I think we're going to go ahead and move on though, because I want to get to our heirlooms. Our reading for next week is very interesting. So, about the Civil War quilts and the Underground Railroad quilts. So, be sure to read that. And if anybody has one, then I want to see it. So, send me a picture or something. So, I have a couple of online ones I wanted to show you. This is from Coy Allen. And so, here's a couple of family treasures, my great grandmother's portrait. And the one in the frame, they said needs some restoration on, needs a conservator. They've got all kinds of genealogy though for her, and family timelines. So it's great to have that genealogy to go with the photos. That's really nice when you can see a picture of those people in your timeline. But they were talking about how doing genealogy, some things didn't quite add up. The other pictures, which I'll show you in a minute, are of a 1921 John Deere catalog. It came from Liberty, Kansas garage. It has all kinds of information about farming implements. Probably the best info I enjoy is how to properly hook a horse to a walking plow. So the hay sweep rake picture is the only page marked with prices. So this is that. And then the last one from our online person, Candace Rate. My father was born in Iowa in 1914. I treasure his boyhood collection of marbles, all 656 of them. Included with this marbles, which were originally nestled among pencil shavings in a cigar box, are several lists on scraps of paper where he itemized the various marbles from crockies to winners. These lists were dated from 1924 to 1928 when he was 10 to 13 years of age. It's sweet to see his childish handwriting, and I like to imagine him on his knees shooting marbles with his buddies. And she did a good job of organizing those. Oh, and one more I forgot, sorry. Nancy Shea, here are just a couple of really old heirlooms that have been passed down to me. This wood and mortar pestle is dated to about the late 1700s. So it belonged to her 3 times great grandmother. So that's pretty amazing. From Vermont. And then she has family story about her Uncle John, that was a British soldier during the French and Indian War and present during the massacre at Fort Michilimackinac. I did not pronounce that correct. In 1763. I was always told the mortar and pestle were used to grind grain. Both are scored with many indentions that would support that. The trail pot and paddle were used by a 2-time great-grandmother as she and her family came by wagon train from the Dallas area in the middle 1800s to Iowa. The pot is very heavy, made of iron. The paddle is very worn, made of wood, and was told not to use it to stir. That's by Nancy Shea. So thank you so much. If you submitted things online, I have to submit my PowerPoint ahead of time. So I had some things that came in later. I will include those next week. So don't worry, you're not ignored. I will just put those on next week. So I am going to ask you, I'm going to just let my mom go first because she's got her right here and she's my mom. But uh, those of you, if you want to come and bring, if you can just kind of, if you want to line up, that would be great. You're going to need to come to the microphone. So you're going to have to do that. And Tat here is going to take care of that. Just don't touch the microphone. We try to keep it as sanitary as we can. So, and afterwards, if you want to look at those archival things on the table, feel free to do that. And you can take your mask down to talk. Usually the microphone will pick it up well, but if you would rather do that, that would be great as well. Do you want me to hold it?
Well, I brought a shadow box that my daughter made, but it is my. Okay. Is that good?
There we go.
Ah, there it is. Okay. I brought a shadow box that my daughter had made, my husband's great grandfather. And he we have a story that has been scanned that he wrote. He dated it April 10th, 1940, but he was born in 1856. But he kind of ran away from home. He went west and did all kinds of different things. And there was a time when his family, he the Indians kidnapped his oldest son, and so he and some others went after and found the Indians. He had a man that was could trail the Indians and some help there. But anyway, they were able to get the boy back, and the people were surprised that they even came back at all. But then he ended up being a marshal. Yes, a marshal in Kingman. And so there's the badges here, and there's just all kinds of different things about his life, and he. But it's really special that we have the story, and that's why we're talking about writing down the story if you know it. So, and you can come up and look and see what all is there.
Well, this is my grandmother's wedding dress, and she was much tinier than I am. But she was married in 1907, and so it would be, let's see, 113 years old, this dress is. And the next, I have one other thing, and it is the original National Republican Convention tickets in Chicago, Illinois, from 1888. My great grandfather was a Kansas state representative, and so he would have been 47 years old when he went to this national convention in Chicago. It was June 19th, 1888, and they're the original tickets. And the Republican nominee for president was Benjamin Harris of Indiana. He defeated Democratic President Grover Cleveland of New York that year. And these are the original tickets, and they look like almost brand new. I've had them in my family Bible, and so they have really been well preserved. So anyway, if you'd like to look at them, you're welcome to.
Hello, I brought a picture. This was at my grandmother's house as long as I can remember, so I have it at my house now. And especially when we were children, we thought this was neat because of the guardian angel. And I found this in, I guess my grandparents had a farm in Poughkeepsie, Arkansas, and this is the farm record book dated 1935, which is 85 years ago. And that is the year that my grandfather passed away. My mom was 2. And so this is kind of neat because it's his handwriting. And it's got kind of a daily journal of what he did, if he was farming, breaking ground, going to church. I think he went sow hunting. There's one that's kind of neat too. So I thought that was kind of neat. Because that was his handwriting. I didn't realize that till today when I was looking at this. So thank you.
I have just a little anecdote, and then I also have a question for you. I spent a few weeks working a temporary job in Topeka at a bookbinder, and my desk was right next to the counter by the front door. And once or twice a week, someone would come in with the family Bible, and it was so sad because the paper was made from wood pulp and was so cheap, they could not rebind it for the people. The best they could offer was an archival box. So I would encourage you, if you have an old family Bible and it doesn't have very good quality paper, you might want to start an online log instead of the paper one, or get a really good quality Bible, because they also run out of room. Our family has found out. The photos that you see advertised, we can restore this photo. What do they do to restore that photo?
You know, I'm not sure exactly of the whole process that they do, but it does involve some, chemicals and sort of almost like restoring painting, where they're trying to restore the color to that. And some of it, they'll try to remove some of that damage, but it's a chemical process is what it is. But a lot of times they will scan it and try to just make a higher quality scan from it. Or sometimes if there's things missing, like if there's a picture that's torn,
Right.
they can sort of try to, fit that in on what it's going to look like digitally. But it would still look like the original. But as far as what the whole process involves, I'm not sure what they do. Yeah. Vince, did you have something? No? I'll show your picture next time. Do you want to show the items that you have? Okay. Well, I'll show those next time. He sent me an email, and so we'll show those next time. Anybody else have anything? Oh.
This is in contrast to your story about Family Bible. We did have one that the paper was in good enough shape, so my parents were able to get it rebound. This monster is from 1895, and the center does have vital statistics of a lot of family members.
Family Bibles can be a great source of genealogy information for sure. So I think those are really neat to have. Is anything else? I do have, we'll just kind of close with this. There was one more thing here by Nancy Emerson. And her father brought this back from World War II. He was a Marine and was on numerous islands. Her mother found this after he died and knew nothing about it. It's metal covered in thin paper. It looks like it had white powder in it. And she was just trying to figure out what to store it in. She wanted something that was archival, but that you could see. And she contacted Gaylord, and they did not have something for. And I don't know that you're going to find an archival box with a clear cover on it, but because this is metal, I think even though I guess it has a little bit of a paper covering on, it's hard to tell, but I think even just an acrylic box, if it's something that you wanted to display, I think you could display it in an acrylic box, keeping it away from elements. And of course, you're going to want to keep it away from any moisture, any light. But even if you wanted to display it on a shelf, maybe in a curio cabinet or something, I think would be completely fine. If you wanted to store it away somewhere, I think just a regular archival box would be fine. But if it's something you want to display, I think you're fine to display it as long as it's somewhere where it's going to be protected. And like I said, you can even get acrylic boxes. Casey's Store Fixtures in Kansas City, I order acrylic risers that we use for exhibits to set things on, just to have different levels. And they have all kinds of things. And they have very reasonable acrylic products of all kinds. So that might be a possibility for you. Okay, well, that concludes our session today. And thank you all for coming, and we will see you next Thursday.